So, it's a great pleasure to have with us today Angelo Soto-Centeno from Rutgers, Newark, from the sort of sister department of environmental sciences up there at Rutgers, Newark. Angelo, I guess you did your PhD. You're from Puerto Rico.
That is correct.
And you did your PhD at the University of Florida. And I couldn't actually find when did you come to Rutgers, Newark?
That was 2017. I spent about 5 years as a postdoc at the American Museum of Natural History before I joined the faculty.
Great. So yeah, Angelo studies mammals, bats, I think, as a specialty. And I was interested in having him talk to us today, in part to sort of see the intersection between changing climate and biodiversity, sort of through the lens of bats. I think particularly in the Caribbean is what we'll hear about today. So this seminar is going to be recorded, and for those who are interested, I have a separate link if you'd like to meet up with Angelo after the talk. You can either just send me your email in the chat, or I can post a link in the chat. But you're happy to join if you'd like to chat a little bit afterwards. So just let me know. And I think with that, I'll turn it over to you, Angelo.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you so much for this invitation. I'm gonna make sure I can share this properly. And
Angelo, did you want to turn your camera on too, or?
Oh, yeah, if that's possible. I'd like to do that.
Yes. You should be able to just hit start video towards the bottom left, and you can turn on your camera.
All right. Oh yeah, it says that the host stopped it. So every time I try to choose it.
Oh. So you're not allowed to do that, I guess.
Yeah, that's all right.
Well, no, we can. Let's see. One of us should be able to change that.
Try it now.
All right. Just got it. Here I am.
Oh, there you are. Great.
Perfect. Let me go ahead and flip this really quickly. Oops, that's not the screen. There you go. I think that you should be able to see my screen now.
Yep, we're good.
All right, perfect. So as I was saying, thank you very much, Ben, for this really great opportunity. I'm really psyched to be here chatting with you today. Like you described, I am trying to bring something very integrative, kind of bridging some typical things that you would actually see through an Earth and Environmental Sciences focused department with more biological sciences as well. So the work that we do in my lab is very integrative. And I put together a seminar that kind of borrows from some things that I have presented before, combined with some really recent things that we just got out. And so let's go ahead and get started. I don't think that really have to work too hard to convince you that islands are really neat systems to study biodiversity and the processes that shape the organisms that live there. Islands are really complex in terms of their geology, their geography, their topography. They have incredible habitat variation. And also we see that there's differential climatic regimes. They have different levels of connectivity or isolation from the mainland. And if we look at islands in more recent times, we see that there's quite a bit of different levels of human mediated disturbance. Now, the islands that we're going to talk about today are the islands of the Caribbean, also known as the West Indies. I'm going to try to choose here my laser pointer. And this archipelago here is divided in 3 main island groups. So to the north, we have the banks of the Bahamas, including Turks and Caicos. Down here, we have the big islands of the Greater Antilles. It's Puerto Rico here in the east. That's where I'm from. There's Hispaniola, Jamaica, and the really big island is Cuba. And to the east side, you see an eastern arc here. This is a volcanic arc forming the Lesser Antilles, right? So this is basically the leading edge of that Caribbean tectonic plate, right over there. Now, these islands are really neat because they have a very deep geologic history, and it is estimated that the configuration of the Greater and the Lesser Antilles kind of more or less reached that point roughly about the end of the Miocene. So there's actually has been quite a bit of time for the evolution of the biodiversity in these islands to to really kind of take shape and kind of mature, right? These islands are incredible in terms of the organisms that they live there, and they're considered one of the top 10 biodiversity hotspots in the world. And the reason why they're hotspots is because they actually hold a significant proportion of endemic species, right? And just kind of to name a few of my favorites, you know, we have little radiations of lizards, like this dwarf anole that we see here. You may recognize the anolis lizards for being a classic example of adaptive radiation in biology and evolutionary biology, where different ecomorphologies kind of converge independently on different islands. We also have here little Coqui Frogs that you might have heard from, perhaps on a negative connotation because they're incredibly invasive in Hawaii, but they are native to many species are native to the Caribbean, and many of the islands in the Caribbean show some of the highest levels of endemism you can imagine. In some islands, you can actually find that 90% of all of the species of these Coqui Frogs are endemic to only a single island, which is incredible. And also we see this really charismatic and flamboyant birds, which, you know, are incredibly diverse as well, and many endemic species occurred also throughout the Caribbean. Now, while there is a high level of endemism in the Caribbean, and their islands are considered hotspots of biodiversity, they're also kind of considered a hotspot of extinction. So when we look at, for example, other vertebrates like mammals, we estimate that from the non-flying terrestrial mammals that live in the Caribbean, at least 80% of those have been completely extinct from this archipelago. There only have been identified and found as fossil species, right? There are only a few exceptions of non-flying land mammals that are still alive. For example, there's different species of large rodents called hutillas, as well as some of my favorites over here, the Solenodons. There's two species of this really super interesting insectivore. This is about the size of, let's say, a regular size shoe, if you may. So it's a fairly large animal, fully terrestrial. It burrows underground, and the ancestors of this Solenodons date back to roughly about 80 million years back. So this is a really ancient lineage that only exists in the Caribbean. It's kind of like a relic of this lineage of insectivores. Now, despite those high levels of extinction that we see in non-flying terrestrial mammals, when we look at flying mammals, for example, bats, right, they do actually show lower rates of extinction. So it's estimated that only about 18% of all of the species of bats that occur in the Caribbean have shown some sort of extinction. We know them from fossils only. So the majority of bats have actually survived. And even if we were to document cases of extirpation, meaning that the species is lost from only a region, not the entire Caribbean, right? Or it's like a population level loss, we see that that level of loss reaches only 30%. So comparatively, there have been fewer extinctions of bats compared to non-flying mammals in this region. Now, obviously, bats are pretty unique among other mammals because they can fly and they can fulfill or they can fit within, you know, a real large variety of nocturnal ecological niches. But given that they have actually been mostly survivors in this extinction game in the Caribbean, that kind of makes them a really good model to understand the processes that shape communities across time. Now, bats in the Caribbean are also incredibly diverse. This is only a sample of some of the species that we have here. In total, we have 61 different species of bats, and they kind of range from your classical insectivorous bat that only eats insects and nothing else, to nectarivorous bats, to strictly frugivorous bats, and even fish-eating and crab-eating bats. So there's really interesting, not only kind of morphological diversity and species diversity, but so there's also neat ecological diversity as well in these islands. In terms of levels of endemism, the bats in the Caribbean also don't fall behind. My most recent estimates that are soon to be published in a book about the bats in the West Indies are that 3/4 of all of the bats that we find in these islands are actually found only in the Caribbean, nowhere else in the world. So it's a really fun place to go and find, discover that type of diversity. Now, the work that we do in my lab kind of focuses on 3 different areas. So we combine really integrative approaches on, phylogenetics and population genetics to do species delimitation, just to understand what are the species that live in different islands and where the limits of those species are. We also do quite a bit of conservation biogeography and do quite a bit of environmental or habitat suitability modeling, ecological niche modeling to understand where the suitable climatic habitat is for the species that exist there today. And we do quite a bit of paleontology as well. So we go to different places, document the past diversity in the form of fossils. And we combine all of these three different or somewhat seemingly disparate fields into a program that deals with extinction and speciation biology. Now, as you can imagine, at the most basic level, this program requires us to go out into the field and collect these animals and basically just sample the diversity that exists there. So we put all sorts of contraptions to catch these animals and document the diversity that we see today. When we catch these bats, we assess, obviously we identify what species there is to make these inventories. We assess, their general health, if it's a boy or a girl, we take some external measurements. And we also take a teeny tiny wing punch. We use a sterile biopsy punch to take a little piece of the wing. We make a tiny little 3mm hole in the wing, and we use that tissue, bring it to the lab, extract DNA from it, and that's how we actually build the data sets for our genetic analysis. Don't worry, these bats are able to fly home, no problem. The wing of a bat is actually very flexible. It's actually kind of comparable to your fingernail cuticle. Give it 10 to 20 days, and this tiny little wing punches that we take are completely sealed, and the bats are basically released in the site where we capture, and they live happily ever after. So we do this to document the diversity of today, but also we conduct fossil different excavations to unearth fossils. And that way we basically document the diversity of the past. So we're kind of trying to see what the present communities are and the past communities as well. And just to kind of like as a general plug, this program actually has been really great at offering different opportunities for students and many colleagues to gain and do all sorts of different research, gain some research experience in the field, as well as work with analyzing data and helping publish results. The data that we get basically, as I mentioned a second ago, it just kind of straddles that, past towards present communities. And the sites that we have been visiting, for the most part, are from northern Lesser Antilles all the way through the Bahamas, and as well as many localities in the Greater Antilles. Now, all these little red dots that you see here are localities that I have assessed personally. Many of them I actually have helped excavate myself. Others have been data from colleagues, and others, a few of these other localities are obtained from data that has been previously collected and is present in natural history museums. But these are kind of like the broad scale type of data that we get that is just kind of almost completely region wide. And as you can imagine, every time we go and do one of these excavations, we take everything very standardized. So we do a 1 meter, 1 by 1 meter fossil unit, and it's excavated at 10 centimeter intervals. And from each of these 10 centimeter intervals, we identify all of the species that we get as fossils and select a few of those per interval to do accelerated mass spectrometry and obtain radiocarbon dates. And those radiocarbon dates are basically giving us the ages or the last appearance dates for that specific stratum. And by combining different radiocarbon dates, you can imagine that as we go deeper and deeper and deeper in one of these fossil units, you're going to get ages that are going to be younger and older and older and older, right? Therefore, kind of giving us a perspective or a timescale perspective of how communities have changed over time, okay? Now, you can already imagine that when you stratify things in this type of way, you can ask all sorts of really interesting questions, and particularly questions that are comparative from past to present are always of interest to me. And for many years, I've actually been focusing on working on targeting this particular question of whether or not climate change that occurred in the past contribute to biodiversity loss. And we know that there are many examples of vertebrate systems in which climate change has been attributed to really strong changes or drastic changes in species distributions, into glacial refugia, for example, and some other vertebrates have been attributed to have become extinct due to climate change. And a similar story actually happened in the Caribbean, in which quite a bit pretty much all of the extinction and extirpations documented to this region were previously related to climate change during the Pleistocene-Holocene transition. So this is kind of a transition that happened roughly about 11,000 years ago, right? And authors have claimed that these extinctions happened because of changes in suitable habitat and also land area loss as sea levels actually rose. Now, superficially, when you look at this, it kind of makes sense, right? So here is a cartoon that I made a little bit ago that documents the last 500,000 years of our climate history on Earth, right? So within the gray bars, we see that these represent cold glacial times where, well, it was pretty cold, so glaciers were really big. Most of the water is frozen, so the sea levels are characteristically low. And then the white bars represent those times that are warm interglacial, like what we have today. Again, because it's warm, glaciers melt, and sea level is characteristically high. That squiggly line that we see here kind of represents the sea level changes across time as you go from a glacial to an interglacial period, all the way to more or less the sea level of today. So as you can see, we've had at least six cycles from, freezing to toast, freezing to toast, right? And this actually has created that eustatic sea level change to continuously go up and down over time. And obviously this sea level change has had really drastic effects on all land masses across Earth, right? But on islands, you may argue that these effects may be particularly drastic because they have a really limited area, right? As you can see from this image that I showed a little bit ago, you can see that it's almost kind of like a bathymetric map in which you can see the ocean depths. The really dark areas are deep ocean, and the really light color areas are very, very shallow bits of ocean. At points, at glacial times, when the sea level was actually very low, those areas, in fact, show or represent areas that were exposed land back in the day. So you can imagine that today we see several hundred little islands in the Bahamas, but back in the day when sea levels were low, as recently as 21,000 years ago, these islands actually were really, really gigantic and formed like 3 different banks, right? So they were like really large paleo islands. That's what sometimes have been described. And again, because of this, this kind of drastic changes, we can see why scientists have actually relied on that explanation of climate change to explain these losses. Now, what I try to do was just to go and more directly test this hypotheses with more kind of modern methods. And for this, I kind of developed what I call like a multi-species paleontological and climate analysis, right? By integrating the data from fossils, I can use them as independent data sets. I can build these climate models that are based on ecological niche modeling approaches to understand how suitable habitat has changed over time. So this is generally how these models work. So we can obtain climate data for the present. You can include all sorts of different variables, including temperature, precipitation patterns across a particular region that you're interested in. And you can combine those and build a relationship with the places where you observe that species today. Now, from this relationship that you build, a model can be produced that can tell you where the suitable climatic conditions or suitable environmental conditions exist for these animals to have viable populations, right? So it's a model that predicts where the suitable habitat is. But the neat thing about these methods is that you can also use climate of the past. And based on what you know, you can build a projection that is backwards in time, right? So you can estimate, in this case, it says last glacial maximum, right? You can estimate what the suitable climate conditions were 21,000 years ago for this particular animal. Now, the really robust part of the method that I employed here is that we actually have a really rich fossil data sets, right? And that's very, very unique. And not very many people have access to such material. And what I did in this case is I built a statistical validation using the radiocarbon dated fossils backwards in time. So I try to match the time of the fossil with the model, the time scale of the model in the past to validate the predictive performance of these models, right? So in this way, I can physically say like, well, these models of the past are actually predicting something that makes sense. And not only that, I can also kind of overcome the assumption that, well, do we know if the climate, the species tolerances for this climate has changed over time or not, right? So in this case, this validation kind of gives us a little bit more certainty that these predictions across time actually make sense. And the analysis that, this type of analysis I've done for multiple species of bats in the Caribbean, you can see them actually kind of labeled here with green dots. These are a sample of some of the species that I've done. And the patterns that I find are fairly congruent across all of these animals. Today, what I'll do is I'll focus a little bit of the information on two species that kind of form kind of representative two species of that show the patterns that I want you to kind of emphasize and kind of drive that message, right? And these are the greater Antillean long-tongue bat. This little guy over here, it's a little nectar feeding bat. So it's about the size of my thumb. It's a very, very little thing. And also the red fig eating bat way up here. And both of them are endemic to the West Indies. This is a fairly regional endemic, found only in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. This guy is only found in primarily the Greater Antilles. So let's start with the Greater Antillean long-tongue bat. One neat thing about this work is that we can actually combine the present day data or the present day observations with the past, right? And combine them on a spatial context, right? So in this case, we see the Greater Antilles and the Bahamas, and the yellow dots here represent the places where we find this animal alive today. So we can find this little bat across the Greater Antilles and the Southern Bahamas today. And the red dots represent the places where we actually have found this animal as a fossil, right? Now, you can see that some islands like the Greater Antilles, they have both modern and fossil localities. This kind of indication that this animal has actually persisted there and is still alive today over time, right? But really interestingly, we also find that I found some fossil sites right in the northernmost Bahamas over here. This is the island of Great Abaco, in which I was able to identify fossils of this Greater Antillean long-tongue bat. Not only that, these fossils were already carbon dated directly, and the age of that particular, or the last appearance date of that particular fossil is about 1,800 years ago. So not very old. So this kind of gives us a little bit of a hard evidence that, wait a minute, like that transition that happened from the Pleistocene to the Holocene, roughly about 11,000 years ago, doesn't really quite match with the dates that we're having here today, right? So these fossils kind of represent that hard evidence that these bats were survivors for thousands of years before they actually became extinct, right? They became extinct 1,800 years ago. This is a time that the climate conditions were very similar to what they are today. But to very directly test, whether a suitable climate habitat existed throughout this time, we can actually use ecological niche modeling like I described just before, right? And here we have predictions for the present, the mid-Holocene, and then late Pleistocene, right? So basically this is like each of these colors, the blue, orange, and brown, represent where areas of suitable climatic habitat exist across time, right? So this is habitat that is consistent for the, and habitat that kind of represents the areas where the species should be able to survive, right? That little dagger there kind of just represents that locality where we found it extinct, right? And as you can see from all of these three maps, there's suitable climatic habitat throughout time on all of these regions. And from this map, we can actually put them together and build what is known as a suitability model, right? This is basically a combination of all of the three areas, where the suitable areas exist consistently across time. Now, this is not saying that climate did not change. This is actually indicating that suitable climatic condition for this particular animal to exist still occurred consistently across time. And based on these models, we see that, places where we find these extirpated populations up here in the north, they actually remain climatically suitable over time. So we can reject that climate change hypothesis for extinction. It was not the only factor contributing to the loss of this bat. But you may be asking yourself, well, then what other factors may have contributed into the loss of these animals? And to answer this type of questions, we can also look at a different system from a study that I did very recently with some of my collaborators in the island of Cuba. Now for this project, we examined an entire vertebrate community for the western side of Cuba and across 17 different localities. And here we have past communities for all sorts of different vertebrates. Here's a tarsometatarsal of an extinct owl. This is a giant owl that stood about a meter tall from the ground, no longer present. We have many insectivores that are no longer present. We have like a large rodent, a Hutia mandible, a species that is no longer present in the island today. And up here we have a bunch of bats, many of which are not present today, including vampire bats. So these are two different skulls of an extinct vampire bat that used to live in the island of Cuba and it's not present today. So you can see that this site has a really incredible diversity. But not only, those few vertebrates, we actually were able to collect data on all sorts of different vertebrates, from birds, reptiles, mammals, both volant and non-volant, as well as some human fossils as well. And in this figure, I kind of just generally summarize how this vertebrate community kind of change over time, right? So the little teal circles will represent a last appearance date or the last time a particular species was found in the record. The orange ones represent the very earliest appearance date, right? As we documented from this fossil data set. And so if you were to follow a species horizontally, you can actually see that some of them actually survive throughout time. Others actually survived for a little bit of time and then became extinct, right? So this is all time scale from the present all the way back to over 20,000 years back in time. Now you can actually see that some species did survive. There's little arrows there representing, some of the species that still we find them today, but we also found them as members of the fossil community. But as you can see, there's many species that are showing as extinct, right, or completely gone. We don't find them alive today. So what we did in this study was basically try to build a relationship, and I try to make it as good as possible in this figure by mapping out, different time intervals, right? For example, here we have like late Pleistocene. So here's where we would have that Pleistocene-Holocene transition at 11,000 years ago, more or less. Then we get the early Holocene, middle Holocene, and the late Holocene all the way to the present, right? But in addition to that, this vertical lines that we have here, the vertical dashed lines kind of represent the three time intervals where humans actually arrived into these islands. So letter A represents the early Amerindian colonization. This is roughly about 6,000 years back. B represents the second colonization of Amerindians. This happened roughly about 1,500 years ago. And then the C represents kind of like the post-Columbian. So this is kind of like about 500 years of Columbian colonization into the Caribbean. And based on the last appearance dates, we see that at least 45% of the losses that we document on this particular data set actually occur during that late indigenous interval, showing somewhat of a relationship that as humans actually become more prevalent, biodiversity goes away, right? Or becomes extinct. And this was only just looking at all, 27 different specimens, but we also build associated relationships for each of those dates. So from each stratum, we have a few fossils that we directly radiocarbon date. But any other fossil that is contained within that particular stratum that we dig, it contains an associated date, right? So we built 127 fossil date associations, right? These are data from fossils that were not directly dated, but that belong to a particular stratum. And we can see that from the entire data set, 72% of those last appearance dates belong to the late Holocene. And from those, we see that 70% were gone in the late Amerindian and 30% of those in the early Amerindian, right? Not only that, when we compare across all of this community, the different sizes of the species that we see that become lost, we see that the survivors include only, or the majority are medium-sized species, and the ones that become extinct are actually at the extreme, the very small size, the very large size of those vertebrates. Now, you may actually see from this data that there's quite a bit of an association that, perhaps once humans show up, things actually become a little bit cookie for these animals to be in, and they become extinct. There's an association of the arrival of humans and the loss of biodiversity. There's not a really tight relationship between these two things. In other words, there's no evidence that humans are causing these extinctions directly. Potentially indirectly, but there's no real evidence that puts one and one together, right? So all of this is just circumstantial, right? So to get at understanding how these extinctions actually may happen, I try to use not modern anthropogenic and natural factors may matter in terms of putting a species at risk, right? And to tackle this question, we had to find a very suitable candidate to be able to do this. And we chose the red fig eating bat. This is an endemic species that occurs only in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And it is a forest specialist that is also a strict frugivore, right? So we're looking at those traits that are associated to the extinction susceptibility results that we just saw a second ago, right? Now, this bat also has been shown to be very susceptible to the effects of hurricanes and habitat fragmentation. And in fact, certain studies from the late 90s have shown that after really strong hurricanes have passed the island of Puerto Rico, this bat completely disappears from some regions, and it may take up to 5 years for them to come back. Now, where they go, we don't know, and how this animal's recovering, we also don't know. Again, these animals are forest specialists because primarily they live on trees. So any tree that is cut down, that means, basically you're chopping down possibilities for these animals to actually find suitable places to live, right? Now, when we look at places in the Caribbean, islands like Puerto Rico today, we actually see them to be, fairly green, right? So it's kind of like a satellite photograph of what Puerto Rico looks like today. And we can quickly identify that there's many urban centers, that have kind of chopped down quite a bit of the natural forest. There's some agricultural lands as well that seem pretty barren. There's not a lot of forest cover. But it's important to know that these islands have also been drastically altered, especially after the times that European colonizers showed up. Many of the islands of the Caribbean, particularly the Greater Antilles, lost a significant amount of their vegetation. So it's estimated, at least for Puerto Rico, that over 90% of the native vegetation at some point was completely gone. And everything that we see today is primarily secondary forest. Now, these forests are distributed in different parts of the island, and the primary areas that are protected they form 5 different core areas. And we have here to the east, we have El Yunque National Forest, and also we have the Carita State Forest. And then kind of central and west, we have the Toro Negro State Forest, Maricao, and Rio Bajo State Forest. Now, this forest throughout the island, because they're protected, they should actually be centers of diversity, right? This is where most species should actually find suitable habitat. However, many of these animals that we have in this island also are fairly generalistic, right? This is one of the reasons why looking at something like the red fig eating bat, because it's such a specialist, becomes pretty important. Now, what we did here in this particular case is that we use a special kind of modeling that is based on circuit theory. And the circuit theory modeling basically creates relationships between the localities where the species exists and the habitat that is suitable for the species to see how well these localities connect, right? If you get point A and point B and the habitat in between is highly suitable, you will see a lot of connectivity. If you still get point A and point B and there's like very unsuitable habitat in the middle, then you won't see any connectivity at all, right? So I'm going to show you a series of maps that give you a little bit of a perspective on how connectivity throughout Puerto Rico changes for the red fig eating bat, depending on the scenarios that we give them. So at a first pass, we try to build pretty much what we would consider a null model, right? We know it's a forest specialist that needs dense forest to find roosts and places to eat. So we decided to build a model that includes, only land use area. So whether it's a forest, there's agricultural patches or urban centers, right? So urban centers here are actually shown in black. Agricultural, non-agricultural areas are kind of these brown regions. And then the model prediction for connectivity is shown in this scale that goes from blue all the way to yellow. Yellow indicates very high possibility of connectivity between localities, and blue represents very low possibility of connectivity. All of these stars represent the places where we find the red fig-eating bat today, right? And as you notice, when we don't give it any other sort of information, so we're assuming that all of the habitat could be suitable for these animals to move around, we see almost like a gradient of connectivity, right? While there's actually centers that we can see is like highly connected localities, connectivity may actually be lower through some places, but there's still kind of like intermediate connectivity throughout the island. So this is why we think that, or this is why we built this as a null model, because there's almost no restriction on how these localities should connect. Now, to see how the effect of deforestation happened from natural events, we use satellite data that basically quantifies the percent cover of vegetation. And in this case, I'm going to show you a connectivity map just following the Hurricane Maria that happened in 2017. Many of you may know that this was actually one of the strongest hurricanes Puerto Rico has had in the last 100 years, and it completely cleaned up the island. The deforestation was rampant. And you notice immediately that our connectivity analysis all of a sudden is able to still identifies corridors, but there's quite a bit of the area that shows as not suitable or basically not likely to be connected, right? So we see immediately that hurricane-mediated deforestation can have an effect on whether or not connectivity could happen between all of these different localities where we find this bat. Still, connectivity remains. However, this model still can actually be built to be a little bit more realistic, because the truth is that not every patch of forest is suitable for these species to exist. So what we did is that we built a connectivity model based on suitable habitat and forest cover, but including only those places where the animal is modeled to be known to sustain viable populations. And here's that model in particular, and you can see that the connectivity analysis start kind of becoming a little bit more refined, highlighting that the center and western parts of the island, particularly those forests that we see that are protected regions, they form hubs on the western side. The eastern forests that are protected, they actually do show some connectivity, but connectivity occurs in two main corridors with low levels of connectivity in between. If you remember a couple of slides ago, there's actually some urban centers that actually cut through here. And while their development is not too high, these zones are areas that are currently under no type of protection. So we identified, there's two different corridors based on connectivity analysis, and we suggest that these are corridors that are perhaps in need of protection so that we can maintain the connectivity for this bat across the island. What's the worst that could happen is that if these corridors are completely disconnected, some of these bats for this forest specialist species are not going to be able to move back and forth, and any chance events may actually completely disrupt these populations and have these localized or regional extinctions that may happen either through human-mediated deforestation or through natural phenomena. So what have we seen today? In general, we have four main points that we can drive from this. First, we see that radiocarbon chronologies and ecological niche modeling suggest that the Pleistocene-Holocene transition and the associated climate change and sea level changes was not necessarily as important as some scientists thought before. We see that vertebrate community loss in many places post-date the arrival of humans in Cuba. So we see that also a similar thing in the Bahamas, where fossils are only, less than 2,000 years old. But there's not necessarily a human extinction association that is direct. Yeah, there might be an influence there, but we have not really directly found any evidence pointing that out. We see that exploration of community level phylogenetics and artificial neural networks, they kind of show that bat extirpations are random. There's no phylogenetic association. And possibly factors that may contribute to extinction susceptibility include being a plant visiting bat and being an endemic species. And lastly, we see that that within an island, right, in a very, very fine scale, protected forest patches can serve as hubs for bat population connectivity and helping increase or maintain biodiversity for many of these places, many of these islands in this biodiversity hotspot. All right, this is what I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Great. Thanks a lot, Angelo, for the very interesting talk. Do we have any questions for Angelo? You can type them in the chat.
So yeah, I'm gonna have to close my screen so I can, let's see, I'm gonna stop sharing and then I'm gonna be able to see everything normally.
Or I can also read the
There we go.
questions if there are any. So, I mean, I guess I would ask, as you've kind of given us this sort of interesting sort of past story into the present. So what do you think about the, what's your sort of prognostication for the future in terms of, how these different species of bats, how they might fare moving forward?
This is a pretty neat question and something that we haven't really quite explored as much as we may need or as we should. But colleagues of mine have actually studied the Hispaniolan Solenodon, that little large insectivore that I showed in one of the beginning slides. And that particular mammal has been strongly affected by human impacts. Deforestation, they don't do well when habitat is highly modified. And what they did is they also took ecological niche modeling approach, and I helped them put them together some methods that they can standardize, not only by looking at how the distribution of suitable habitat, from past to present is, but also into the future. But these models were also scaled by human population growth and the predicted deforestation that may happen into the future. And what we see with these animals is that suitable habitat not only shrinks, but connectivity between these habitats also gets completely destroyed. Now, the bottom line in this particular story is that for species that are highly specialized, there's not very good news for them. I would argue that while some scientists, for example, in terms of bats, some scientists have basically told me like, hey, but these animals have lived with hurricanes throughout their entire evolutionary history. They're used to it. And I was like, yeah, they're used to the hurricanes, but they're not used to humans that arrived just 500 years ago, right? So the habitat that is disrupted by a hurricane is a temporary thing. And it's not very even also. So the habitat will recover over time, and maybe the bats actually may be able to kind of move back and forth and recolonize those areas as they get forested. The loss that we see when humans arrive is generally a more permanent transformation of that habitat. And for those species that are specialized, that they cannot live in the middle of the city, that may be very dreadful. In general, I would say for bats. That may be very dreadful. Now, there are bats that are generalists. They don't care, and you find them anywhere, and those probably will do just fine. But the point about the biodiversity crisis is like we're losing our early species in a really fast rate, and we want to try to remediate this before they actually become extinct in the near future.
Great. So we have a question. So Kathleen Lonnie writes, just curious, but were you able to determine if some species went extinct, or did they maybe interbreed, evolve into a new species?
That would be very rare in mammals in general. There are only a few cases that are well known in which hybridization may lead to a different species. In fact, one of the cases is interestingly in the Caribbean, where there's a hypothesized species that came from the hybridization of two species. One colonized from South America, the other one colonized from the Caribbean. They met in the middle. Somehow they were closely related enough that they could actually hybridize. That's not generally the case. Hybridization is not very common for bats. So you want to, this question is, you might want to think of it in terms of, well, I guess like it's a little bit more complex to answer than I probably anticipated, because you actually want to think about it in terms of like how many species are able to first reach these places, right? And how many closely related enough species may reach afterwards to be able to kind of rescue them or interbreed, right? And when we look at these islands, some of the genetic data that I have produced with other studies, so part of the work that we did in the lab, in my lab, is that we look at population genetics and we see how genetically related populations are within an island. Most of the findings that we've seen, particularly in some of the papers that we published recently, is that these bats show up on an island and they become genetically structured. While they are closer related to the same species on another island, they're not really moving back and forth. The movement back and forth happen at some point in time, but our estimates of migration are incredibly low, like 0.0014 individuals per generation. It's pretty much nobody moves. So there's going to be a very rare event to have these animals, once they're gone, to have them rescued by close relatives or close populations, right, from neighboring islands. And that might be one of the things that, well, will make things worse, will exacerbate the whole situation, is that if we continue with this fast pace of habitat transformation, any random event may wipe out a population that may not have enough time to be rescued by a neighboring population, given that chances of migration are so low.
Any other questions out there? Good. Let's go ahead and thank Angelo for a good talk.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thanks for everyone for joining.